Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. A time of brutal winters, clashing axes, and untamed wilderness. We're diving into what life was really like if the Vikings had successfully conquered America. Forget the romanticized Hollywood depictions and noble savage narratives. The truth? You probably wouldn't last a single winter. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are you listening from a cozy apartment in New York, or perhaps a cabin somewhere in the Nordic countries? I'm always curious to know. Now dim the lights, settle into your most comfortable position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1015 AD. The good news? The longships have arrived with fresh supplies. The bad news? You're about to discover that paradise always comes with a price. The morning mist clings to Eriksfjord like a lover reluctant to leave. You can taste the salt in the air, mixed with something else, something wilder. Pine resin, wood smoke, the faint metallic tang that follows a successful hunt. This is your world now, and it smells nothing like the stories your father told you about the old country. You stretch your arms above your head, feeling the familiar ache in your shoulders from yesterday's wood splitting. The sleeping furs are warm against your skin, caribou hide that your mother tanned herself using techniques passed down from the Skraelings. Yes, that's what you call them, the native people. The word means wretches in Old Norse, though you've learned to respect their knowledge more than the name suggests. Your longhouse is modest by Norse standards, but it's home. The walls are thick timber chinked with moss and mud, designed to keep out the brutal American winters that make even hardened Vikings weep for their mothers. 24 feet long, 12 feet wide, with a central hearth that never quite dies completely. The smoke hole in the roof has a clever sliding cover, another trick learned from the locals. The sound of your father's axe biting into wood echoes from outside. The rhythm is steady, methodical, almost meditative. He's been at it since before dawn, preparing for winter the way other men prepare for war. Because in this land, winter is war. You roll out of your sleeping area and pad barefoot across the earthen floor to the small window. It's just a hole, really, covered with scraped seal intestine that lets in light while keeping out the worst of the wind. Through it, you can see the growing settlement of New Trondheim spread out before you like a Norse fever dream. 43 longhouses now, arranged in rough streets that follow the natural contours of the land. Your people have learned to work with this continent rather than against it. The buildings sit on raised stone foundations, lifting them above the spring melt that turns the ground into a sucking bog. Wooden walkways connect the houses, elevated paths that keep feet dry, and spirits up during the endless mud season. Smoke rises from every chimney, thin grey lines that dissipate into the overcast sky. The smell carries stories: whale oil burning in the chieftain's hall, seal fat rendering in the widow Astrid's workshop, fresh bread from the communal bakehouse made with flour ground from native acorns mixed with precious barley brought from Greenland. Your stomach growls at the thought of breakfast, but first you have duties. In this settlement, everyone works. Children as young as 5 have responsibilities. Adults who don't contribute don't eat, and people who don't eat don't survive the winter. It's that simple. You dress quickly in wool pants and a linen undershirt, then pull on your kirtil, the long tunic that marks you as a free person rather than a thrall. The fabric is rough but warm, woven from sheep's wool dyed with local berries that turn the cloth a deep burgundy color. Over this goes your leather belt, from which hangs your seax, the long knife that serves as tool, weapon, and status symbol all at once. The leather of your belt is darkened with age and wear, supple from years of daily use. Your father crafted it when you turned 13, marking your transition from childhood to young adulthood. The bronze buckle bears the image of Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, a reminder that even in this strange new land, the old gods still watch over their people. Your seax rests in a wooden sheath bound with iron bands, the blade itself forged from the finest steel your father could produce. The handle is carved from antler provided by a grateful Skraeling hunter, decorated with intricate knotwork that tells the story of your family's journey to this continent. It's not just a weapon, it's a piece of your history made tangible. Your mother is already up, of course. She's always up before the rest of the family, tending the fire, preparing the morning meal. checking the storage pits where food hibernates through the cold months. She looks up as you enter the main room, her pale blue eyes assessing your readiness for the day ahead. Those eyes have seen more than most women her age. She was barely 16 when she left Iceland with your father, pregnant with your older brother, who died of fever during the second winter. She's buried 3 children in American soil, each loss carving lines deeper into her face, each survival making her more determined to protect what remains of her family. The Skraeling trading party should arrive before midday, she says without preamble. Your mother doesn't waste words. Your father wants you to help with the negotiations. This is significant. You've been included in trading talks before, but usually as an observer. To be asked to help suggests your parents think you're ready for greater responsibility. At 17, you're of an age where such things matter. In the old country, you might have been expected to raid for your first taste of wealth and glory. Here, success is measured in different terms. The morning porridge is thick with barley and flavored with wild berries your sister gathered the previous day. It's sweetened with maple sap, another gift from the native peoples who taught your mother how to tap the trees and boil the sap into syrup. The taste is rich and complex, nothing like the simple gruel that sustained your family during their first desperate winter in America. Your sister sits across from you, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. At 12, she's already taller than most girls her age back in the homeland, fed on a diet of fresh fish, wild game, and native plants that seem to agree with Norse constitutions. Her hair is the pale gold of summer wheat, braided with colored threads, in the style that's become popular among the settlement's young women. She chatters about the day ahead, about the lessons she'll receive from grandmother Solveig in the arts of textile production. The old woman survived the journey from Iceland despite being past 60, her knowledge of weaving and dyeing techniques proving invaluable in a community where every thread must be carefully conserved and every garment must last for years. Your father enters as you're finishing breakfast, his massive frame filling the doorway. Eric the Steady, they call him, a man whose reputation for reliable craftsmanship has made him one of the settlement's most respected citizens. His beard is streaked with grey now, the result of 20 years spent building a life in a land that tests every assumption about what's possible. The iron shipment from Greenland is 3 weeks overdue, he announces, settling onto the bench beside your mother. If it doesn't arrive before the harbour freezes, we'll be working with whatever scrap we can find until spring. This is more serious than it might sound to outsiders. Iron is the foundation of Norse technology, the material that makes their tools superior to anything the natives can produce. Without regular shipments of raw iron from Greenland, the settlement's blacksmiths would be reduced to recycling old weapons and tools, gradually losing the technological advantage that helps maintain the balance of power with neighboring tribes. Your mother serves your father his breakfast, the portions carefully calculated to provide maximum nutrition without depleting stores that must last through the long winter ahead. Every family in the settlement performs the same calculation, balancing current needs against future uncertainties. It's a mathematics of survival that becomes instinctive after years of practice. The Skraelings mentioned something interesting during their last visit, your father continues between bites. They spoke of iron rocks, places where the metal can be found in the ground rather than having to be shipped from across the ocean. This catches your attention immediately. Iron ore deposits would transform the settlement from a dependent outpost into a truly self-sufficient community. The ability to produce iron locally would eliminate the uncertainty of supply ships, provide trade goods for exchange with natives, and create the foundation for expanded settlement throughout the continent. But it would also change the fundamental nature of the community's relationship with both Greenland and the surrounding tribes. Self-sufficiency breeds independence, and independence can lead to conflicts that dependent colonies avoid through necessity. The political implications are as significant as the practical benefits. After breakfast, you join your father at his workshop, a substantial building that serves as both smithy and general metalworking facility. The structure is larger than most family homes, with thick stone walls to contain the heat of the forge and multiple work areas for different types of projects. The forge itself is a marvel of adapted technology, combining Norse ironworking traditions with innovations learned from necessity. The bellows system uses native hardwoods that burn hotter than European varieties, while the design incorporates ventilation techniques observed in Skraeling pottery kilns. It's a practical example of the cultural synthesis that makes survival possible in this demanding environment. Your father begins the day by checking his current projects, examining the progress of various commissions that keep the workshop busy, a set of farming tools for a family planning to expand their cultivated area, hunting spears designed to native specifications but crafted with Norse precision, a complex lock mechanism for the chieftain's treasure chest, a reminder that even in the wilderness, some possessions require protection. Each project represents a different aspect of settlement life, a different challenge in adapting old world skills to new world requirements. The farming tools must be sturdy enough for rocky American soil, but light enough for extended use. The hunting spears must meet native expectations for balance and functionality, while demonstrating Norse superiority in materials and craftsmanship. Watch the color of the metal as it heats, your father instructs, demonstrating the technique for judging temperature without the sophisticated measuring devices that European smiths might use. Too hot, and the iron becomes brittle. Too cool, and it won't hold an edge. The balance is everything. The lesson is about more than metalworking. Everything in colonial life requires balance. Cooperation with natives balanced against maintaining Norse identity. Adaptation to local conditions balanced against preserving essential traditions. Innovation balanced against the proven methods that ensure survival. You spend the morning practicing basic techniques, heating and shaping iron under your father's careful supervision. Your hands have grown strong from years of this work, your eye trained to recognize the subtle signs that distinguish success from failure. The skills you're learning will serve you well regardless of what the future holds. The rhythmic hammering creates a meditation that allows your mind to wander to larger questions. What kind of life awaits you in this settlement? Will you follow your father's path as a craftsman, essential but not wealthy? Will you join the hunters and traders who range far from the settlement, seeking new opportunities in the vast continental interior? Or will you be among the settlers who push further west, establishing new communities in territories that remain unmapped and largely unknown? Each possibility carries its own risks and rewards. Craftsmen enjoy security and respect, but rarely accumulate significant wealth. Hunters and traders face constant danger, but have opportunities for both profit and adventure. New settlements offer the chance to build something from nothing, but require giving up the safety and comfort of established communities. As mid-morning approaches, the sounds of arrival echo through the settlement. Voices calling greetings in multiple languages, dogs barking excitedly, children running to see the visitors. The Skraeling trading party has arrived exactly when your mother predicted they would. You clean your hands and change into clothing more appropriate for formal negotiations. Not your finest garments, which would suggest either disrespect for daily work or desperation to impress. Clean, well-maintained clothing that demonstrates prosperity without ostentation. The balance is crucial in a culture where every detail of appearance communicates information about status and intentions. The trading party numbers 7 individuals as expected, but their composition tells a story that requires careful interpretation. 3 are familiar faces from previous visits, establishing continuity and respect for established relationships. 2 are strangers, possibly representing new tribal interests or testing the settlement's reaction to unfamiliar negotiators. The remaining 2 are young men about your own age, perhaps being introduced to the trading process as you are. Their leader is the man your father calls Raven's Wing, though you suspect that's not his real name. The natives seem to have different names for different occasions, different relationships, different seasons. This one is perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair braided with what look like small bones and feathers. His clothing is a mixture of traditional hide garments and Norse wool acquired through previous trades. The formal greetings are conducted in a mixture of languages, Norse words combined with Skraeling phrases and gestures that carry meanings words cannot convey. The ritual acknowledges the dignity of both parties while establishing the framework for mutually beneficial exchange. It's a diplomatic dance refined through years of practice. The negotiations take place in the Chieftain's Hall, the largest building in the settlement. It's a space designed to impress, with carved wooden pillars and tapestries that tell stories of Norse heroes and gods. The high ceiling disappears into shadows where ravens nest, adding their occasional commentary to human discussions. Bjorn Ironfist presides over the gathering, his massive presence lending weight to the proceedings. The chieftain is a man who commands respect through achievement rather than birthright, having earned his position through successful leadership during the settlement's most difficult years. His judgment in matters of trade and diplomacy has kept the community prosperous and relatively peaceful. The hall fills gradually as word of the trading session spreads through the settlement. Not everyone attends, but enough people gather to demonstrate community interest without overcrowding the space. The audience includes craftsmen hoping to acquire rare materials, families seeking specific trade goods, and elders whose experience provides valuable perspective on negotiation. You sit beside your father as the formal presentations begin, observing the subtle interplay of languages and gestures that characterize cross-cultural communication. Each side displays their goods with pride, but without desperation, maintaining the dignity that successful negotiations require. Trust is built through demonstrated competence rather than emotional appeals. Raven's Wing examines each spear point individually, testing the edge with his thumb, flexing the metal to check for flaws. His approval is shown through subtle nods and grunts rather than enthusiastic praise. These people don't waste emotion on commercial transactions, understanding that excessive enthusiasm can be interpreted as weakness or deception. The spear points represent weeks of careful work, each one forged to specifications learned through years of trial and error. The points must be sharp enough to penetrate thick hide, strong enough to withstand the impact of striking bone, and balanced properly for accurate throwing. Meeting these requirements while working with unfamiliar materials requires skills that few European smiths possess. In return for the spear points, the Skraelings offer winter furs that surpass anything available through European trade networks. Beaver pelts so thick and soft they seem alive to the touch. Wolf fur with guard hairs that shed water while trapping warm air. Bear hide strong enough to turn a blade, while remaining flexible enough for clothing. But furs are only part of the exchange. Clay pots fired to temperatures that Norse kilns cannot achieve, their surfaces decorated with geometric patterns that seem to shift in changing light. Medicinal herbs that European physicians have never catalogued, plants whose properties the natives understand through generations of careful observation. Dried fish prepared, using techniques that preserve both nutrition and flavor through the longest winters. Berries processed into concentrated cakes that provide essential vitamins when fresh food becomes unavailable. Nuts ground into flour that can supplement grain stores when supply ships fail to arrive. Knowledge flows both directions during these exchanges. Norse metalworking techniques that allow the creation of tools impossible to produce using Stone Age methods. European agricultural practices that increase crop yields when adapted to local conditions. Navigation skills that enable longer trading expeditions and more accurate mapping of continental geography. The Skraelings share information about weather patterns, animal migration routes, and seasonal changes that affect everything from hunting success to safe travel. They describe distant tribes and their customs, territorial boundaries that must be respected, and opportunities for future trade relationships. But today's negotiations include something new. Something that makes the adult Vikings exchange meaningful glances. A small leather pouch containing seeds, unlike anything they've seen before. Maize, Raven's Wing explains in his broken Norse. Plant when ice goes, grows tall as man, feeds many. The implications are staggering. A crop that could grow in this climate, that could reduce dependence on shipments from Greenland, that could finally make the settlement truly self-sufficient. Your father accepts the seeds with the gravity they deserve, knowing that they represent a potential turning point in the colony's history. The discussion that follows reveals the complexity of the gift. Maize requires specific planting techniques, careful timing, and protection from pests that European farmers have never encountered. Success depends not just on having the seeds, but on understanding the entire agricultural system that supports their cultivation. Raven's Wing describes the companion planting methods that maximize yield while minimizing soil depletion. Beans that fix nitrogen in the soil while climbing corn stalks for support. Squash that spreads along the ground, suppressing weeds while conserving moisture. The three sisters, as the natives call them, working together to create abundance from cooperation. But the agricultural knowledge comes with warnings about the social implications of adopting native farming methods. Other tribes might view such adaptation as either respectful integration or dangerous appropriation, depending on how it's implemented and what other changes accompany it. The trading continues through the afternoon, but the atmosphere has changed. The exchange of goods has become secondary to the exchange of ideas, possibilities, and concerns about the future. Both sides recognize that they're negotiating more than trade relationships. They're discussing the fundamental question of how different peoples can coexist on the same continent. As shadows lengthen across the settlement, practical considerations reassert themselves. The trading party must return to their own village before darkness makes travel dangerous. Final agreements are confirmed, goods are loaded onto travois, and farewells are exchanged with the courteous formality that maintains dignity on both sides. Your father walks with you back to the longhouse as the visitors disappear into the forest, their departure as quiet and efficient as their arrival. The settlement settles into its evening routines, but conversations buzz with speculation about the implications of the day's negotiation. The seeds are important, your father says quietly as you walk, but they're also a test. The Skraelings are deciding whether we're worth keeping around. This stops you in your tracks. You'd assumed the trading relationship was permanent, beneficial to both sides. Unquestionable. The idea that your entire community might be evaluated and found wanting is unsettling in ways you struggle to understand. What do you mean? Your father pauses, choosing his words carefully. We're not the first outsiders they've dealt with. There are stories, old stories, about others who came from across the water. Some were welcomed and prospered. Others, he shrugs. Others aren't part of the stories anymore. The implication hangs in the air like smoke from the evening fires. The natives have dealt with foreign visitors before, and not all of those encounters ended well for the visitor. The current peaceful relationship isn't guaranteed to continue, and the balance of power could shift without warning. Are we in danger? Not immediate danger, your father replies. But we're being watched, evaluated, judged according to standards we don't fully understand. The seeds are a gift, but they're also a test. If we use them wisely, prove that we can be trusted with native knowledge, the relationship might deepen. If we disappoint them, he doesn't finish the thought, but the conclusion is obvious. Disappointment could lead to the end of trading relationships, increased tensions, or even open conflict. The settlement's prosperity depends on maintaining the delicate balance that keeps both sides satisfied with the arrangement. The evening meal is a family affair, but the conversation is subdued by the weight of the day's revelation. Your mother serves fish stew flavored with wild herbs, bread made from the last of the summer berries, and small portions of preserved meat. The food is good but not abundant. It never is. Every meal is calculated against the supplies that must last until the next trading opportunity or supply ship. Your sister chatters about her day, about the new kitten that's appeared in the storage barn, about the stories the elder women tell while they work. Her innocence is both charming and heartbreaking. She was born here like you, but unlike you, she doesn't yet understand the precarious nature of your existence. To her, this is simply home, as natural and permanent as the mountains that surround the fjord. Your parents discuss the day's negotiations in low voices, analyzing every gesture and phrase for hidden meaning. They speak of other settlements, other trading relationships, other communities that have thrived or failed based on their ability to navigate the complex politics of intercultural contact. Some settlements have achieved remarkable prosperity through careful diplomacy and mutual respect. Communities where Norse and Skraeling children play together, where intermarriage has created families that bridge both cultures, where innovation flows freely in both directions. These success stories provide hope and models for emulation. Other settlements have collapsed into suspicion and conflict, their populations scattered or destroyed through misunderstanding and mistrust. Warriors returning from failed expeditions carry stories of violence that began with minor disputes and escalated beyond anyone's ability to control. These cautionary tales provide warnings about the consequences of diplomatic failure. Your own settlement occupies a middle ground between these extremes, maintaining peaceful relations without achieving the deep integration that characterizes the most successful communities. The relationship is functional but fragile, profitable but not transformative, stable but not necessarily permanent. As darkness falls, the settlement quiets for the night. Fires are banked rather than extinguished, preserving coals for quick rekindling in the morning. Night sounds filter through the wall, the distant howl of wolves, the splash of fish jumping in the fjord, the soft murmur of conversations in neighboring houses. Outside, the aurora borealis begins its nightly dance across the northern sky, sheets of green and blue light that seem to pulse with otherworldly energy. The natives have their own explanations for this phenomenon, stories about spirits and ancestors and the boundary between worlds. Your people see it as a reminder of the god's presence, a sign that Asgard watches over its children even in this distant land. You lie in your sleeping furs, listening to your family breathe around you, your father's snores, your mother's soft sighs, your sister's quick, innocent breaths. These sounds have been the soundtrack of your life, reliable as sunrise, comforting as summer rain. But tonight, other sounds intrude on the familiar symphony. The wind carries hints of change, whispers of distant events that might affect your small community. Somewhere to the south, other settlements are facing their own challenges, their own tests of survival and adaptation. The network of Norse communities that spans the American coast is constantly shifting, growing and shrinking as circumstances permit or demand. You think about the seeds your father accepted today, about the agricultural revolution they might represent. Success with maize cultivation could transform the settlement from a marginally viable outpost into a genuinely prosperous community. Failure could be interpreted as evidence that Norse colonists lack the wisdom to be trusted with native knowledge. The stakes are higher than they initially appeared. This isn't just about food security or economic independence. It's about proving that different cultures can learn from each other without losing their essential identities, that progress can come through cooperation rather than conquest, that the future might hold possibilities that the past never imagined. You drift off to sleep with the taste of wood smoke in your mouth and the sound of distant wolves in your ears, unaware that tomorrow will bring visitors who will challenge everything you've learned about living in this new world. The last thing you remember is the soft glow of the aurora through the smoke hole, a reminder that some mysteries are too beautiful to solve, too magnificent to fully understand. In your dreams, the settlement prospers beyond your wildest imagination. The maize grows tall and strong, providing abundance that makes all other worries seem trivial. Trade relationships deepen into genuine friendships. Cultural exchange enriches both communities, and the careful balance between adaptation and tradition creates something entirely new and wonderfully sustainable. But dreams, however beautiful, can't protect against the realities that tomorrow will bring. You wake to the sound of horns, but not the familiar bronze instruments your settlement uses for daily signal. These are war horns deep and resonant, carrying a note of urgency that brings you instantly alert. The sound echoes off the mountains that surround the fjord, multiplying and distorting until it seems like the earth itself is screaming. Through the thin walls of the longhouse you can hear running footsteps and shouted orders. Someone pounds on your door, the urgent rhythm that means immediate danger. Your father is already up, strapping on his mail shirt with the practiced efficiency of a man who's done this before. The iron rings catch the firelight as he moves, creating patterns of light and shadow on the walls. "What's happening?" you ask, though part of you already knows. "Runners came from the southern settlements," he replies, not slowing his preparations. "Thorvald's Harbour, Freydis's Landing. They're gone." The words hit you like cold water. Thorvald's Harbour, where your cousin Magnus had been learning the shipwright's trade. Freydis's Landing, where your mother's sister raised her family of 4 children. 2 entire settlements wiped out, dozens of families, people you've known your entire life, merchants and craftsmen and children who played the same games you did. Gone. Your mother appears with your own mail shirt, a smaller version of your father's that he'd had made for you last spring. The weight of it across your shoulders is both comforting and terrifying. You've trained with weapons, practiced combat techniques, but you've never faced real violence. The Vikings of your generation have been colonists first, warriors second. The mail shirt is beautifully crafted, each ring forged with care and linked with others to create flexible protection that moves with your body. The steel is good quality, imported from Greenland at considerable expense. Your father had insisted on the finest materials, understanding that armor is only as strong as its weakest component. "It's not just raiding," your father continues, checking the edge of his battle axe. "This is coordinated, planned, The Skraelings have been watching us, learning our patterns, our weaknesses. The axe in his hands is a weapon worthy of the sagas, its blade broad and sharp, its handle bound with leather for secure grip. Runes are carved into the metal, ancient symbols that invoke the protection of Thor and the blessing of Odin. It's been in your family for 3 generations, carried by your grandfather during the raids that established the family's reputation for courage and skill. Outside, the settlement transforms around you. The peaceful village of yesterday becomes a fortress preparing for siege. Men emerge from longhouses carrying shields and spears, their faces grim with the knowledge that everything they've built is suddenly at risk. Women gather children and elderly family members, moving them toward the central hall where thick walls offer better protection. The transformation is remarkable and terrifying. People who were neighbors and friends just hours ago now move with the deadly efficiency of warriors preparing for battle. Children who were playing innocent games yesterday now help their parents prepare for violence that could claim their lives. The community's dogs sense the tension and bark nervously, adding to the chaos. Livestock are driven into hastily constructed pens within the defensive perimeter, their welfare now secondary to the need for organized resistance. Every decision is made through the lens of survival, comfort, and convenience, sacrificed to necessity. You step outside and see the source of the alarm. Smoke rises from the southern horizon, multiple columns that tell their own story of destruction and death. The settlements aren't just abandoned, they're burnt. Someone wanted to make sure they couldn't be reoccupied, that the Norse presence would be completely erased from those territories. The smoke climbs straight up in the still morning air, black pillars that mark the funeral pyres of entire communities. The sight fills you with a mixture of rage and terror, emotions that war with each other for dominance. These were your people, your extended family, your cultural inheritance being reduced to ash and memory. Bjorn Iron Fist, your settlement's chieftain, stands on the steps of the great hall addressing the gathered crowd. He's a giant of a man, with arms like tree trunks and a voice that can carry across a battlefield. But today, even he looks shaken by the news that's reached the settlement. The Southern Alliance has made their choice, he announces, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. No more trading, no more coexistence. They want us gone, and they're willing to kill to make it happen. The crowd murmurs at this news, a sound like wind through dry leaves. Many families have relatives in the destroyed settlements, people they'll never see again. Trade relationships that took years to build have been severed in a matter of days. The careful balance your people have maintained with the native populations has collapsed. What about Raven's Wing? Someone calls out from the crowd. What about the Western tribes? Bjorn's expression darkens. Unknown. We sent messengers at dawn, but... He shrugs. The implication is clear. The messengers might already be dead, their horses wandering riderless through forests that have suddenly become hostile territory. You think about yesterday's trading session, about the seeds and the careful negotiation. Had Raven's Wing known what was coming? Were the seeds a parting gift or a test to see how your people would react under pressure? The memory of his face provides no answers, only more questions about loyalties and intentions. The defensive preparations continue throughout the morning, every adult contributing according to their abilities and knowledge. The settlement's location had been chosen partly for its natural advantages. Built on a raised point of land, with the fjord on one side and steep hills on the other, it could only be approached from 2 directions. Trenches are dug across these approaches, their depths measured carefully to provide maximum obstacle value, without consuming too much time and labor. The excavated earth is used to build ramparts behind the trenches, creating elevated positions for archers and stone throwers. Sharpened stakes are planted in the trench bottoms, angled to catch anyone who falls or jumps into them. The defensive works aren't sophisticated by European standards, but they're appropriate to local conditions and available resources. No enemy expects to face elaborate fortifications in the American wilderness, and even simple obstacles can provide decisive advantages to prepared defenders. Every adult has a role to play in the preparation. The women and older children gather stones for throwing, selecting them for size and weight, while bundling them in convenient carrying cloths. Arrows are checked and counted, their points tested for sharpness, their fletching examined for damage that might affect accuracy. Children too young for combat are assigned to carry water, tend the wounded, and maintain communications between different parts of the settlement. Even the youngest community members understand that their survival depends on everyone contributing to the collective defense. Bandages are prepared from torn clothing and stored in central locations where they'll be easily accessible when needed. Medicinal supplies are inventoried and distributed to people with healing knowledge. Food and water are rationed to ensure that defenders maintain their strength throughout what might be a prolonged siege. The older warriors share tactical knowledge gained through decades of experience in different types of combat. They discuss strategies that worked in similar situations back in the homeland, adapting European military wisdom to American conditions. Their advice focuses on practical matters, how to maintain formation under pressure, when to advance and when to retreat, how to recognize the signs of enemy weakness. You're assigned to the eastern wall, a palisade that faces the most likely approach route. Your position is between two experienced fighters, Halfdan the Far-Traveled and Einar Crowkiller. Both men have seen real combat, not just in raids, but in pitched battles where kingdoms rose and fell in a single day. Halfdan earned his name through trading expeditions that took him as far as Constantinople, where he learned about Byzantine military tactics and weapons technology. His shield bears the scars of a dozen battles, its wooden surface reinforced with iron strips that have turned aside countless weapons. Einar's reputation comes from a different source, a legendary encounter with a massive raven that had been terrorizing a Norwegian village. The bird, possibly rabid or magically influenced, had killed several children before Einar tracked it to its nest and destroyed it with a single arrow. The incident established his reputation as a marksman and earned him a place in local folk. Remember, Halfdan tells you as you adjust your grip on your spear, they'll try to overwhelm us with numbers. Don't get fancy. Thrust, step back, thrust again. Stay behind your shield and trust the men beside you. The advice is simple but profound. Viking warfare depends on discipline and mutual support more than individual heroics. The shield wall, the fundamental Norse battle formation, works only when every warrior maintains his position and protects his neighbors as well as. Individual heroics make for good stories but poor tactics. Your spear is a well-balanced weapon, its ash shaft smooth from years of use, its iron point sharp enough to penetrate mail if thrust with sufficient force. The weapon feels familiar in your hands, an extension of your body rather than a separate tool. You've practiced with it countless times, but practice suddenly seems inadequate preparation for the reality of combat. Your shield is made from lime wood, light but strong, covered with leather and reinforced with iron studs. The boss in the center is designed to deflect weapon strikes while protecting the hand that grips the handle behind it. Painted on the front is your family's symbol, a stylized tree that represents growth and endurance. By midday, the waiting becomes unbearable. Scouts report movement in the forest, but nothing definitive. Shadows that might be men or might be deer, sounds that could be war cries or might be wind through the trees. The uncertainty is worse than knowing, tension that builds without release until nerves stretch to the breaking point. Some defenders pace restlessly along the walls, unable to remain still when danger threatens. Others sit quietly, checking and rechecking their equipment, while trying to conserve energy for the fight ahead. A few pray to the old gods, invoking the protection of Thor and the wisdom of Odin. The settlement's children have been moved to the most protected areas, but their frightened faces appear occasionally at windows and doorways. They understand that something terrible is happening, that their peaceful world has suddenly become dangerous. Some cry quietly, others cling to their parents with desperate intensity. Then, just as the sun reaches its highest point, they come. The first wave emerges from the tree line like a tide of nightmare, their appearance so sudden and coordinated that it seems almost supernatural. Dozens of warriors painted for war, their faces streaked with red and black pigments that transform them from familiar trading partners into terrifying enemies. They move with the fluid coordination of people who've trained together extensively. The war paint serves multiple purposes beyond intimidation. The patterns identify tribal affiliation and warrior status, while providing spiritual protection according to native beliefs. Red represents the blood of enemies. Black symbolizes death and the spirit world. Together, they announce that these men have come to kill and are prepared to die. But these aren't just the Skraelings you've dealt with before. Mixed among the local warriors are others, men from tribes you've never seen, Taller figures with different weapons, different war paint, different tactical approaches. The Southern Alliance isn't just local natives united by shared grievances. It's a confederation that spans hundreds of miles, united by a single goal, driving the Norse back into the... The diversity of the attacking force tells a story of extensive planning and political coordination. Representatives from dozens of tribes have somehow overcome traditional rivalries and territorial disputes to focus on the common threat of European colonization. The achievement represents a level of strategic thinking that European observers consistently underestimate. Some warriors carry traditional weapons, stone-headed clubs, obsidian-tipped spears, bows with arrows fletched using eagle. Others wield captured Norse weapons, iron axes, steel knives, even a few swords taken from previous. The mixture suggests both the Confederation's growing military capability and their determination to use every advantage available. The war cries that follow chill your blood, not because they're loud or threatening, but because they're so perfectly coordinated. These aren't the random shouts of undisciplined fighters getting pumped up for battle. They're calculated battle calls that serve as both intimidation and communication, conveying tactical information while demonstrating the unity of the attacking force. "Archers!" Bjorn's voice booms across the settlement, cutting through the war cries with practiced authority. The first flight of arrows arcs over the palisade, a cloud of death that whistles as the shafts cut through the air. Most strike the wooden walls or embed themselves in the ground, but some find target. You hear screams from inside the settlement, voices you recognize crying out in pain and fear. A young woman named Ingrid, barely old enough, staggers backward with an arrow through her shoulder. The wound bleeds freely, but she remains conscious and alert. Two older women immediately rush to help her, applying pressure to control the bleeding while assessing whether the wound is immediately life-threatening. Your own archers return fire, but their targets are already... The natives don't stand still to be shot at like European armies trained in formal battle tactics. They dart between trees, use natural cover with expert skill, advance in short rushes that make them difficult to hit. This isn't the static warfare that Norse tactics are designed for. The attacking warriors move with an understanding of the terrain that comes from generations of experience. They know which rocks provide solid cover, which trees will stop arrows, which routes offer concealment while advancing toward their objectives. Every step is calculated to minimize exposure while maximizing progress toward contact. The first direct assault comes at the main gate, a mass of warriors carrying what looks like a crude battering ram. But the attack is more sophisticated than it initially appeared. The ram itself is a feint, designed to draw attention and defenders, while the real assault develops elsewhere. While the main gate defenders focus on the battering ram, smaller groups scale the walls at other points using ropes and ladders that appear from nowhere. The attacking force has clearly studied the settlement's defenses, identifying weak points and preparing specific countermeasures for each obstacle. "Behind us!" Einar shouts, spinning to face warriors who've appeared on the walkway behind your position. Your careful formation dissolves into individual combat as the fight becomes a desperate scramble for survival. The shield wall, that fundamental Norse tactical formation, becomes impossible to maintain when enemies attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Each defender must fight for his own life, while hoping that others do the same. Your first real enemy is a young man about your own age, armed with a stone-headed war club and nothing else. No armor, no shield, just paint and fury, and the absolute conviction that he's fighting for his homeland. His weapon is crude by Norse standards, but effective in skilled hands, capable of crushing bone and splitting skulls with a single well-placed. He swings the club at your head with enough force to cave in your skull, the stone head whistling through the air with deadly... The attack comes without warning or mercy, a killing blow delivered by someone who sees you as an invader, worthy only of... Instinct takes over, training replacing conscious thought as your body reacts to mortal danger. You get your shield up just in time, feeling the impact shiver through your arm as the club strikes the wooden surface. The force of the blow drives you backward, your feet sliding on the wooden walkway as you struggle to maintain. The club rebounds from your shield, leaving your attacker momentarily off balance as the kinetic energy transfers back through his weapon. It's a small opening, lasting perhaps half a second, but it's enough. Your spear thrust is clumsy but effective, the iron point sliding between ribs and into vital organs with sickening ease. His eyes go wide with surprise rather than pain, shock overtaking his system before nerve signals can register the extent of his injury. He looks down at the spear protruding from his body, then back at your face, his expression shifting from aggression to confusion to something that might be understanding. For a moment, you see him not as an enemy, but as someone's son, someone's friend, someone who woke up this morning thinking he would survive the day. His war paint can't hide the fact that he's barely older than yourself, probably fighting his first real battle just as you. The similarity is more disturbing than the differences. Then he dies, his body going limp around your spear as life drains out of him like water from a broken pot. You have to pull your weapon free and turn to face the next threat, the dead warrior already becoming another obstacle to step around, rather than a human being whose life you've just ended. The fighting is unlike anything you'd imagined based on stories and songs about glorious war. The sagas speak of heroic single combat, of warriors facing worthy opponents in battles that test skill and courage against equally matched enemies. This is butchery, desperate and ugly and necessary, where the only goal is to kill before being killed. You fight beside Halfdan as he holds a breach in the wall, his axe rising and falling with mechanical precision. Each blow drops an enemy, but more keep coming like some nightmare tide that can't be stopped by ordinary humans. They climb over the bodies of their dead comrades without hesitation, driven by a fury that seems almost supernatural. The veteran warrior moves with deadly efficiency, his experience evident in every motion. He doesn't waste energy on unnecessary flourishes or dramatic gestures. Every swing of his axe serves a purpose, every step positions him for the next attack. His breathing remains steady despite the intense physical demands of continuous. "Stay close!" he shouts over the din of battle. "Don't let them isolate you!" The advice is sound but difficult to follow when enemies seem to appear from every direction. The carefully planned defense has devolved into a series of individual fights, each defender struggling to survive while hoping that others do the same. Coordination becomes impossible when simple survival requires total concentration. A spear thrust gets past your guard, scraping along your ribs and tearing through your mail shirt like it's made of cloth. The iron point finds a gap in your armor, drawing blood but not penetrating deeply enough to cause serious injury. The pain is immediate and sharp but not debilitating. You've been cut, not seriously wounded. The distinction matters when survival depends on staying in the fight. The wound burns like fire, blood seeping through your torn mail to stain your clothing. But the bleeding isn't severe enough to weaken you quickly, and the injury doesn't affect your ability to use your weapons. You'll survive if you can avoid taking more serious damage. Blood makes your grip slippery, forcing you to readjust your hold on spear and shield. The metallic smell fills your nostrils, mixing with the smoke from burning buildings and the dust kicked up by countless feet. Your mouth tastes of copper and fear, flavors that seem to define the experience of. Hours pass like minutes, or maybe minutes pass like hours. Time becomes meaningless when death comes in waves, when every moment might be your last, when the world shrinks to the few feet around your position. The sun moves across the sky, but you're too focused on immediate survival to notice its. Your world becomes the faces of enemies who want to kill you, the familiar voices of friends fighting beside you, the constant calculations of distance and timing that determine whether you live or. Everything else fades into irrelevance, including thoughts of the future that might not exist. The attack continues with relentless pressure, wave after wave of warriors throwing themselves against the settlement's. Some carry grappling hooks to scale the walls. Others wield fire arrows to burn the defenders out. The coordination suggests extensive planning and considerable leadership ability. Fire arrows prove particularly devastating, turning your own buildings into weapons against you. The storage barn catches first, flames spreading rapidly through the dry wood and stored hay. The workshop follows, years of careful craftsmanship reduced to ash. Each burning building reduces the settlement's defensive options, while creating new hazards for the. Smoke fills the air, making it difficult to see and breathe. The acrid smell burns your throat and makes your eyes water, adding another layer of misery to an already desperate situation. Visibility drops to a few yards, turning the battle into a series of sudden encounters that begin and end without. The natives use the smoke as cover, appearing out of the grey haze like demons from the underworld. Their knowledge of the settlement's layout gives them advantages that become more pronounced as visibility decreases. They know which buildings connect to which others, where the walkways lead, how to move efficiently through spaces that defenders struggle to navigate. Gradually, impossibly, the assault begins. The natives are brave but not stupid, experienced enough to recognize when an attack isn't succeeding. They've taken horrific casualties for minimal gain, and their initial advantage of surprise has been lost. Bodies pile up at the base of the walls, creating obstacles that slow subsequent attacks. The turning point comes when Bjorn himself enters the fight, his massive war axe carving through enemy ranks like a farmer harvesting. The chieftain's presence galvanizes the defense, his booming voice cutting through the chaos to coordinate resistance efforts. Warriors rally around him, their confidence restored by his leadership. "Hold fast!" he roars, his axe splitting an enemy skull with a blow that would have felled a tree. They're breaking. The psychological effect is immediate and defenders who were beginning to despair suddenly find renewed strength, while attackers who had been pressing forward begin to hesitate. Morale shifts like a tide, flowing from one side to the other with surprising speed. The war horns sound again, but this time they're calling retreat. The remaining attackers pull back into the forest, dragging their wounded with them when possible, leaving their dead when necessary. The sudden quiet that follows is almost as shocking as the violence that preceded it. Silence that seems unnatural after hours of constant noise. You slump against the palisade, exhausted and shaking from the combination of physical exertion and psychological trauma. Your spear is slick with blood that isn't yours, your shield is cracked in 3 places from repeated impacts, and your mail shirt looks like it's been gnawed by some massive... But you're alive, breathing, capable of movement and thought. Around you, the settlement takes inventory of its losses, while trying to process what's just happened. 14 dead, including 2 women and a child who were struck by arrows. 23 wounded, some seriously enough that they might not survive the night without medical attention that may not be available. For a community of fewer than 300 people, these are devastating. Every death removes not just a person, but a set of skills, relationships, and irreplaceable knowledge. The wounded will require care that strains the community's medical resources while reducing the number of people available for essential work. But the Skraelings lost more, much more. The area in front of the main gate looks like a slaughterhouse, and similar scenes of carnage mark every point where they tried to breach the... You count at least 40 bodies, possibly more scattered across the battlefield like broken dolls. The cost of attacking a prepared position had been higher than they'd anticipated, the price paid in blood and lives for underestimating Norse defensive capabilities. The bodies tell their own story of courage and futility, of warriors who died believing in their cause but failing to achieve their... This was just the first probe, Bjorn announces as the survivors gather in the Great Hall, his voice carrying clearly despite the exhaustion that shows in his... They'll be back, probably tonight, and they'll be smarter. His own armor is dented and blood-stained, evidence that even the chieftain had to fight for his life. A deep cut on his forehead seeps blood that he wipes away absently, his attention focused on the tactical situation rather than personal. The implications sink in slowly, reality penetrating the shock and adrenaline that followed the battle. This isn't over. It might never be over. The careful coexistence your people had built with the native population has collapsed into total war, and total war in this situation could only end one way, with the complete destruction of one side or the other. The settlement's position, so advantageous for trade and normal life, becomes problematic during siege. Surrounded by water on one side and cliffs on the other, there's only one way out. If the natives can block the harbor and the mountain passes, the settlers will be trapped with no possibility of retreat. Night brings no rest. Sentries watch the forest for signs of movement, while the rest of the settlement prepares for siege. Food and water are rationed more strictly, weapons are redistributed from the dead to the living, and urgent decisions are made about strategy and... The dead must be dealt with quickly before they become a health hazard. Norse custom demands proper burial with grave goods, but circumstances permit only hasty interment in a mass grave dug behind the Great Hall. The ceremony is brief and practical, religious observances abbreviated by the need to prepare for renewed attack. Enemy bodies are dragged away from the defensive positions and burned in a massive pyre that sends smoke signals visible for. The flames serve both practical and psychological purposes, disposing of potential disease sources, while announcing to anyone watching that the settlement still has the strength to take offensive. A heated debate develops in the chieftain's hall about whether to send for help. Ships could be dispatched to Greenland, carrying word of the crisis and requests for reinforcements. But those ships would take weeks to make the journey, weeks more to organize a relief force, and weeks to... The settlement would have to survive on its own for most of the winter. The arithmetic is brutal. Even if help were dispatched immediately, it couldn't arrive before the harbor freezes, making relief impossible until spring. The settlement must survive through the winter months without external assistance, facing an enemy that knows the terrain and can replenish its forces from a much larger population. Alternatively, the ships could be used for evacuation. Load the families and as many supplies as possible, abandon the settlement and start over somewhere else. It would mean giving up years of work and accepting defeat, but it would save lives that might otherwise be lost in a hopeless... The prospect of abandoning everything they've built is emotionally devastating, but strategically rational. Every building represents years of labor. Every cultivated field embodies hopes for future progress. Leaving would mean admitting that the colonial experiment has failed, that the dream of Norse America has ended in violence. Your father argues for a third option, negotiation. Not all the tribes have joined this alliance, he insists, his voice carrying the desperate conviction of someone who wants to believe his... Raven's Wing and the Western clans might still be neutral. If we could reach them, explain... Explain what? Bjorn interrupts, his tone sharp with frustration and exhaustion. That we're sorry for taking their land? That we promise to be better neighbors if they'll just let us live? They've made their choice, Eric. Now, we have to... The argument continues deep into the night, voices rising and falling as different factions advocate for different responses to an impossible... Some argue for fighting to the death, maintaining that honor demands resistance regardless of the odds. Others propose immediate evacuation, pointing out that dead heroes can't protect their families. A few suggest trying to hold out until spring, gambling that winter weather will force the natives to suspend their siege, while reducing their own need for supplies. But this strategy depends on assumptions about native capabilities that recent events have called into serious. The debate is ultimately settled by events beyond anyone's control. Just before dawn, a second attack begins with tactics that demonstrate how much the natives learned from their first failure. This time, there's no warning beyond the soft whisper of arrows fired from the darkness. The war horns remain silent, replaced by stealth and surprise that catches the settlement unprepared for renewed violence so soon after the previous. The first you know of danger is when someone screams that the storage barn is on fire again. Fire arrows, the weapon that turns your own buildings against you, strike from multiple directions simultaneously. Within minutes, 3 more buildings are burning, and the flames spread faster than they can be contained. The second assault is far more sophisticated than the first, demonstrating tactical learning that European military theorists would respect. Instead of direct attacks on the walls, the natives use the fires as distractions, while small groups infiltrate the settlement through gaps in the defenses. They move like shadows between the burning buildings, their painted faces invisible in the smoke and flame. These aren't the mass charges of the previous attack, but precise strikes by elite warriors who know exactly what they're trying to accomplish. Each infiltration team has specific objectives. Disable key defenders, destroy critical supplies, create panic among the civilian population. You find yourself separated from your unit, cut off by flames from the defensive positions you'd been assigned to hold. The familiar streets of your hometown have become a maze of smoke and fire, where every shadow might conceal an enemy and every sound could signal death approaching. The settlement's layout, so familiar in peaceful times, becomes alien and threatening when filled with smoke and illuminated by burning buildings. Streets that you've walked thousands of times become confusing obstacles when visibility drops to a few feet and normal landmarks disappear in the haze. A figure emerges from the smoke ahead of you, war club raised for a killing blow. But as he steps into the firelight, you recognize him with a shock that stops your heart. It's one of Ravenswing's men, a trader you've seen dozens of times, someone who knows your name and your family's history. He's a young warrior named Crowfeather, barely older than yourself, who helped carry trade goods during previous visits to the settlement. You remember him laughing at jokes told around the trading circle, sharing food during the long negotiations, playing games with the settlement's children. The transformation from friendly visitor to deadly enemy seems impossible to accept. For a frozen moment, you stare at each other across the space that separates hunter from prey. His face shows the same shock you feel, the same struggle to reconcile past friendship with present necessity. This isn't supposed to happen. You're supposed to be allies, or at least neutral parties engaged in mutually beneficial commerce. His hesitation gives you a crucial advantage, but not one you want to exploit. The part of your mind that still thinks like a colonist, rather than a warrior, wants to call out his name, to remind him of shared meals and friendly conversations. But the part that's learned to think like a survivor recognizes that sentiment is a luxury that combat doesn't permit. The moment passes, and necessity reasserts itself with brutal clarity. He swings his club, you thrust with your spear, and another small piece of the world dies as friendship becomes warfare. The iron point takes him in the chest, sliding between ribs to pierce his heart with the precision of familiarity bred through too much recent practice. He dies with your name on his lips, the word barely audible above the crackling of flames and the distant sounds of continuing battle. The sound will haunt your dreams for years to come, a reminder that war destroys more than lives, that it corrupts relationships and perverts human connections until nothing remains but violence and loss. The battle for the settlement continues until dawn, but the outcome is no longer in doubt. Too many buildings have been lost to fire. Too many defenders have fallen to arrows and axes. The systematic destruction of key structures has made continued defense impossible. The granary burns first, taking with it the stored food that would have sustained the community through the winter siege. The workshop follows, its destruction eliminating the ability to repair weapons and tools. One by one, the buildings that made the settlement viable are reduced to ash and memory. What had been a thriving community 12 hours ago is becoming a charnel house where the living fight desperately for the right to join the dead on terms slightly more favorable than outright surrender. The mathematics of survival have shifted decisively against the defenders. As the sun rises through the smoke, revealing the full extent of the destruction, Bjorn makes the decision that everyone knew was inevitable. The horn sounds 3 long blasts, the signal for general retreat to the ships. The evacuation is chaos given form and urgency. Families grab what they can carry and run for the harbor, leaving behind the accumulated possessions of a lifetime. Children clutch treasured toys, while parents carry essential tools and irreplaceable family heirlooms. Livestock that can't be transported are slaughtered rather than left for the enemy, their blood mixing with human blood to create a slurry that turns the ground into a slippery horror. The cattle that provided milk and meat, the sheep that provided wool and warmth, the pigs that converted scraps into protein, all die together in a desperate attempt to deny resources to the victors. Buildings that survived the fire are put to the torch to deny them to the natives, creating a final conflagration that consumes the last remnants of Norse presence in this part of America. The settlement dies in flames and smoke, its destruction as complete as human effort can make it. You help your family load their few precious possessions onto one of the merchant vessels that had arrived just days earlier with supplies from Greenland. Your father carries a small chest containing his most valuable tools. Your mother clutches a bundle of family heirlooms. Your sister holds the kitten from the storage barn. Everything else, everything that made this place home, is being abandoned to fate and fire. The house where you were born, the workshop where you learned your trade, the fields where you played as a child, all disappearing behind a wall of smoke and flame that marks the end of one life and the desperate beginning of another. The ships pull away from the dock just as the native forces emerge from the forest to claim their victory. They don't pursue the fleeing colonists because they don't need to. They've accomplished their goal completely and decisively. The Norse settlement that had taken root in their homeland has been uprooted and cast back into the sea. You stand at the stern of the ship, watching the smoke rise from what had been your hometown just hours before. The buildings you'd helped construct are burning. The gardens your family had tended for years are being trampled by enemy feet. The careful balance between survival and prosperity that had defined your entire life has collapsed in the space of a single day. Behind you, the survivors huddle together for warmth and comfort that neither the ship nor their fellow refugees can adequately provide. Fewer than 200 people from a community that had numbered almost 300 just 24 hours ago. The mathematics of defeat written in blood and tears and empty spaces where familiar faces should be. Ahead of you lies the unknown ocean and whatever fate awaits beyond the horizon. Greenland, perhaps, if the ships can make the journey before winter closes the sea routes. Or maybe another attempt at colonization, somewhere farther from established native territories. Or perhaps a return to the old country, to Norway or Iceland, carrying the news that the dream of American expansion had died in fire and violence. You're 17 years old, and you've just witnessed the end of your world. Everything you've known, everyone you've cared about, every plan you've made for the future has been swept away by forces beyond your understanding or control. But you're alive, breathing, capable of thought and feeling and hope, however fragile those qualities might seem in the aftermath of disaster. The ship carries you toward an uncertain future, but it carries you there nonetheless, providing the possibility of rebuilding what was lost, of learning from what went wrong, of creating something better from the ashes of what was destroyed. The last thing you see before the settlement disappears completely behind the curve of the earth is the smoke still rising from its ruins, a signal fire that announces to anyone watching that the balance of power in this part of America has shifted decisively and permanently. The ship rocks beneath your feet as it cuts through the grey waters of the Davis Strait, each wave carrying you farther from the only home you've ever known. The hold is packed with refugees who wear their trauma like poorly fitting clothes, obvious and uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. The vessel creaks and groans as it fights through seas that seem determined to claim it as another casualty of the disaster that's consumed your world. Ice chunks bob in the dark water, early indicators of the winter weather that will soon make these seas impassable to all but the most experienced navigators. Your sister hasn't spoken since the evacuation, not a single word in the 3 days since you fled the burning settlement. She sits curled against your mother's side, clutching the kitten that somehow survived the chaos of the evacuation. The animal provides comfort in a way that words cannot, a small warm life that represents continuity in a world where everything solid has crumbled. The kitten's purring is one of the few pleasant sounds in the ship's hold, a gentle vibration that seems to soothe not just your sister, but everyone within hearing range. In a space filled with the sounds of suffering, grief, and barely controlled despair, the animal's contentment provides a reminder that some forms of innocence can survive even the worst human disasters. Your mother strokes your sister's hair with mechanical repetition, the gesture automatic rather than conscious. Her own eyes stare at nothing visible to others, focused on internal landscapes of loss and memory that no one else can navigate. She's aged years in the past few days, lines appearing on her face as if carved by invisible hands. The ship's captain, a weathered man named Eric Bloodeye, moves between the refugees with the careful step of someone who understands that desperation can turn peaceful people violent. His own crew keeps to themselves, professional sailors who've transported human cargo before and know the signs of trouble. Bloodeye earned his name during a younger man's adventure that left him with a damaged eye that weeps constantly, creating the appearance of tears even when he's not emotionally affected. The injury serves as a useful intimidation factor when dealing with difficult passengers, suggesting experience with violence that most people prefer not to test. His crew consists of 12 experienced sailors, men who've weathered storms both natural and human-made. They maintain professional distance from the refugees while providing competent seamanship that represents the only thing standing between survival and drowning for everyone aboard. Food is rationed strictly according to calculations that assume the worst-case scenario for voyage duration. The vessel was provisioned for a trading voyage, not a rescue mission, and feeding 200 unexpected passengers through a month-long ocean crossing requires careful mathematics that leave no room for generosity or waste. Each person receives a bowl of thin porridge twice daily, supplemented with whatever supplies the refugees managed to carry with them during the evacuation. The porridge is made from barley stretched with whatever edible materials can be found, flavored with salt, from the endless ocean that surrounds the ship. Water is even more precious than food, requiring guards and strict rationing that breeds resentment among people who've lost everything else, and now find their basic needs subject to bureaucratic control. The barrels contain enough for normal operations, but refugees drink more than cargo, fear having a thirst that's never quite satisfied. Captain Bloodeye has posted armed guards around the water stores, a precaution that speaks to how quickly civilization can break down when survival is at stake. The guards are chosen from his crew rather than the refugees, men whose loyalty to the ship's command structure outweighs any sympathy they might feel for displaced families. The sleeping arrangements are brutal in their efficiency and complete disregard for privacy or dignity. The cargo hold becomes a mass dormitory where personal space is measured in inches and private conversations become impossible. Families cluster together when possible, but single survivors attach themselves to whatever group will accept them. Children sleep pressed against their parents, while adults arrange themselves according to complicated hierarchies based on former status, current resources, and simple physical intimidation. The strongest claim the best positions, while the weakest accept whatever space remains available. The social structures that governed the settlement have been replaced by the desperate mathematics of shared resources and mutual survival. Former social distinctions become irrelevant when everyone faces the same threats, but new hierarchies emerge based on who controls food, who has weapons, and who possesses knowledge that might improve everyone's chances of survival. Disease spreads quickly in such conditions, moving through the cramped quarters like invisible fire that consumes resistance and leaves weakness in its wake. Within a week of departure, fever strikes down a dozen passengers, their bodies' defenses overwhelmed by stress, malnutrition, and exposure to unfamiliar pathogens. The ship's limited medical supplies are exhausted on the first cases, leaving subsequent victims to rely on whatever folk remedies the survivors remember from their former lives. Your mother proves invaluable here, her knowledge of healing herbs and traditional treatments making her the closest thing to a physician the refugees have. But she works with materials that were never intended for shipboard use, herbs that lose their potency when stored in damp conditions, techniques that require privacy and space that the ship cannot provide. Her efforts save some lives while providing comfort to others who are beyond medical help. Medicine can only do so much when the fundamental problem is overcrowding and malnutrition that weakens everyone's ability to fight off disease. The combination of poor nutrition, contaminated water, and stress creates conditions where even minor illnesses become life-threatening emergencies. 3 people die during the second week of the voyage, their bodies wrapped in sailcloth and consigned to the deep with ceremonies that try to maintain dignity despite the circumstances. The burials are brief affairs, practical rather than ceremonial, attended by the constant awareness that more deaths will follow before the journey ends. Each death diminishes the survivors in ways that go beyond simple arithmetic. Every person who dies takes with them knowledge, skills, relationships, and memories that can never be replaced. The community that's being transported isn't just smaller than the one that left the settlement, it's fundamentally different. The psychological toll proves even worse than the physical hardships, manifesting in ways that make the ship's cramped quarters feel even more confining. Nightmares plague the survivors, dreams filled with fire and blood and the faces of friends who didn't make it to the ships. Sleep becomes elusive, rest impossible. During the day, arguments break out over trivial matters, stress expressing itself through conflicts about sleeping spaces and food portions, and whose turn it is to empty the waste buckets. People who were neighbors and friends just weeks ago now snap at each other over imagined slights and minor inconveniences. The ship becomes a pressure cooker, where normal human tolerance is stretched beyond its limits. Small irritations become major grievances, minor disagreements escalate into serious conflicts, and the basic civility that makes group living possible gradually erodes under the constant stress of uncertainty and loss. Your father organizes work details to give people purpose and prevent the kind of idleness that breeds despair and conflict. Groups are assigned to maintain the ship, to care for the sick, to prepare meals and distribute supplies. The labor isn't always necessary, but it provides structure in a situation where structure has become a luxury most people can't afford. The work details serve multiple purposes beyond simple task completion. They give people something to focus on besides their losses, create small groups where friendships can develop, and maintain the work habits that will be essential for survival regardless of where the refugees eventually settle. Men repair sails and rigging, learning seamanship skills that might prove valuable in future emergencies. Women tend the sick and maintain what cleanliness is possible in the ship's cramped quarters. Children carry messages, sort supplies, and perform simple tasks that make them feel useful rather than merely burdensome. The ship's daily routine becomes a lifeline for people who've lost all other sources of stability and predictability. Meals at fixed times, work assignments that change weekly, evening gatherings where stories are shared and plans discussed. The routine isn't comfortable, but it's reliable. Conversations among the adults center on a single question that has no easy answers. What happens next? Greenland might accept some refugees, but not all. The colony there has its own problems, its own resource limitations, its own population to feed through the winter months. A sudden influx of 200 additional mouths could destabilize the entire Greenland settlement, creating food shortages that affect everyone. The refugees bring skills and labor, but they also bring immediate needs that must be met regardless of their long-term contribution potential. Return to Iceland or Norway remains an option, but not an attractive one for people who've spent years building American lives. Most of the refugees have no property or connections back in the old country, no family members who remember them fondly, no resources to support themselves during the difficult transition back to European life. They'd be starting over with nothing, dependent on the charity of relatives who might not remember them kindly, or strangers who might not welcome additional burdens. For people who've spent years building new lives in America, the prospect of returning to old ones as beggars holds little appeal. Some survivors talk about trying again, about finding another location for a new colony farther from established native territories. But the failure of the American settlements has shaken confidence in the entire colonial project, making it difficult to maintain the optimism that such endeavors require. The natives have demonstrated their ability to coordinate resistance across vast distances, organizing military action that spans hundreds of miles and dozens of tribes. Any future colony would face the same challenges that destroyed the first attempts, only now with the disadvantage of being expected and prepared for. Young people like yourself face the harshest choice of all, caught between worlds with no clear path forward. You've never seen Iceland or Norway, having spent your entire life in an America that no longer exists. Your skills and knowledge are adapted to a world that's been destroyed. Your dreams and plans are tied to a future that's been cancelled. You speak Old Norse, but with an accent influenced by Skraeling words and American experiences that mark you as foreign wherever you might go. You know how to survive in forests and fjords that are now enemy territory, skills that might not transfer to unfamiliar landscapes and different challenges. The ship's progress toward Greenland is slow and uncertain, hampered by headwinds that force long delays and ice formations that block the direct route north. Captain Bloodeye is forced to take detours that add days to the journey, stretching limited supplies even thinner while testing everyone's patience. Each delay increases the risk that winter weather will trap the ship in ice, turning a difficult voyage into a death sentence for everyone aboard. The captain's decisions become increasingly desperate as he balances speed against safety, direct routes against ice conditions, passenger welfare against crew survival. Weather reports from other ships when they're encountered are universally bad. Early winter storms are moving south faster than expected, carrying ice and snow that will make navigation impossible within weeks. The race against seasonal change becomes a sprint, where every day of delay increases the odds of catastrophe. Tempers fray as hope of quick rescue fades into acceptance of prolonged suffering that might not even end in survival. People who maintained dignity and cooperation during the first weeks of the voyage begin to show signs of breakdown as the reality of their situation becomes impossible to ignore. News from other refugee ships, when it comes through chance encounters and signal exchanges, is universally discouraging. The vessel carrying survivors from Thorvald's harbor was last seen fighting heavy seas near Cape Farewell, its overloaded condition making survival unlikely in rough weather. Another ship, carrying families from Frida's landing, had to put in for emergency repairs that might strand its passengers for the winter on some desolate stretch of coast where rescue would be impossible. The coordinated evacuation that had seemed like salvation in the first hours after the attacks is revealing itself as a series of separate disasters. Your own ship develops problems during the third week of the voyage, manifestations of stress and overuse that threaten to turn transportation into entrapment. A leak in the forward hull forces constant bailing, with passengers taking turns at the pumps to keep the ship afloat. The mainsail tears in a sudden squall, its fabric weakened by age and strain beyond its design limit. Repairs are possible, but consume time and materials that can't be spared, while the damaged sail reduces the ship's speed and maneuverability when both are desperately needed. The race against winter weather becomes a desperate sprint, where every delay increases the odds of catastrophe that would claim not just the ship but everyone aboard. Captain Blood-Eye pushes his crew and passengers to their limits, demanding maximum effort when everyone's reserves are already exhausted. The food situation becomes critical as the fourth week begins, rationing cuts that reduce meals to a single bowl of porridge per day, supplemented by whatever fish can be caught during the brief periods when weather permits fishing. Hunger becomes a constant companion, gnawing at morale as relentlessly as it gnaws at empty stomachs. Children suffer most visibly, their energy fading as malnutrition takes hold despite adults' efforts to share their own meager ration. Growth stops, activity decreases, and the bright curiosity that characterizes healthy children is replaced by listless acceptance of circumstances beyond their understanding or control. Your sister's kitten dies during a particularly rough storm, its small body unable to withstand the combination of poor nutrition, stress, and the constant motion that makes rest impossible. The loss affects your sister more than all the human deaths combined, removing the last connection to the innocent world that existed before the disaster. The kitten had represented more than just a pet to the child passengers, serving as a symbol of normalcy and continuity that helped them cope with circumstances that adults struggle to understand. Its death removes that anchor, forcing children to confront the reality that nothing from their previous lives is guaranteed to survive. Violence finally erupts during the fifth week, when two families come to blows over sleeping space near the ship's single brazier. The fight spreads quickly, fueled by weeks of accumulated stress and frustration that finally find expression in physical confrontation. The conflict begins over something trivial, a dispute about who has the right to warm themselves at the only heat source in the passengers' quarters. But it quickly escalates into a brutal struggle that involves more than a dozen people before it can be contained. It takes the intervention of Captain Blood-Eye's crew, backed by drawn weapons and threats of being thrown overboard, to restore order among the passengers. The message is clear: the ship's discipline will be maintained regardless of passenger preferences or the circumstances that brought them aboard. But the incident reveals how close the survivors are to complete breakdown. Their community bonds stretch to the breaking point by disaster and displacement. People who were neighbors and friends now eye each other with suspicion, seeing competitors for scarce resources rather than allies in shared adversity. Your father takes you aside after the violence, his weathered face grave with concern that goes beyond immediate survival. He's aged visibly during the voyage, his hair more grey than brown, his face marked by lines that weren't there when you left the settlement. This is what happens when civilization fails, he tells you quietly, his voice carrying lessons learned through decades of experience. People revert to their most basic instincts. Cooperation becomes competition. Neighbors become threats. Remember this, because it might happen again. The warning proves prophetic sooner than expected, as conditions aboard the ship continue to deteriorate, despite everyone's efforts to maintain order and dignity. A second outbreak of disease, this one more serious than the first, sweeps through the overcrowded hold during the sixth week. Dysentery, the sailor's curse, strikes down victim after victim with a merciless efficiency that overwhelms the ship's already strained sanitation system. The disease spreads through contaminated water and food, poor hygiene, and the stress-weakened immune systems of people who've endured too much for too long. The ship's waste management systems, already strained beyond capacity, collapse entirely under the additional burden of widespread illness. The hold becomes a nightmare of human misery, where the sick and dying share space with those still fighting to survive. Medical care becomes a form of triage, where the healthiest receive attention and the weakest are left to survive or die on their own. Your mother works herself to exhaustion caring for the sick, but her efforts can only slow the inevitable. The combination of malnutrition, contaminated conditions, and disease creates a perfect storm of human suffering. 6 more refugees die before the outbreak runs its course, their bodies joining the others that have been fed to the hungry sea. The deaths aren't dignified or meaningful, just the random casualties of circumstances beyond anyone's control. Each loss diminishes the survivors while highlighting their own vulnerability. The psychological impact of watching people die from disease is different from the trauma of combat, involving a slow degradation that strips away dignity along with life. Disease takes its time, turning strong individuals into helpless invalids who soil themselves and beg for water that might hasten their suffering. By the 7th week, the survivors who remain have been fundamentally changed by their experiences in ways that will affect them for the rest of their lives. The optimistic colonists who had boarded the ship believing in fresh starts and new opportunities have been replaced by harder people who understand that survival requires choices no one should have to make. Food theft becomes common, despite the risks of punishment that could include being thrown overboard. Parents steal from strangers to feed their children, and children steal from parents to satisfy hungers that rational thought can't control. The moral order that governed the settlement has collapsed along with everything else. The theft isn't motivated by greed or malice, but by the simple biological imperative to survive when survival requires resources that official channels can't provide. People who would never have considered such actions under normal circumstances find themselves crossing lines they never thought they'd approach. Weather continues to work against the refugees as the 8th week begins, bringing early winter storms that batter the ship with increasing frequency. Each storm threatens to drive the overladen vessel beneath the waves, sending everyone aboard to join the friends and family members who've already been lost to this disaster. Ice begins forming on the rigging, adding weight that makes the ship harder to control and more likely to capsize in rough seas. The crew works constantly to break away ice formations, but the task becomes more difficult as temperatures drop and storms increase in frequency. Captain Bloodeye calls a meeting of the surviving adults to discuss options that no one wants to consider, but circumstances may force upon them. The ship is too heavily loaded to weather the winter storms that lie ahead, carrying too many passengers for safe navigation in conditions that would challenge even a properly equipped vessel. Either some passengers must be put ashore at the next landfall, regardless of the prospects for survival on land, or everyone risks going down together when the inevitable catastrophic storm finally overwhelms the vessel. The choice is between certain death for some and probable death for all. The debate that follows reveals how completely the community has fractured under the pressure of shared disaster. Some survivors argue for voluntary sacrifice, suggesting that the oldest and sickest should accept death to save the younger and healthier passengers who have better prospects for future survival. Others propose drawing lots, leaving the choice to fate rather than human judgment that might be influenced by personal relationships or unfair biases. A few suggest that families with the most supplies should be given priority, essentially auctioning survival to the highest bidder. Your father speaks for a 4th option, continuing as planned and accepting whatever fate brings, regardless of the consequence. We've come this far together, he argues with the desperate conviction of someone who wants to believe his own words. If we abandon that now, we abandon everything that made us worth saving in the first place. But idealism is a luxury that starvation doesn't permit, and the mathematics of survival don't care about moral principles or community solidarity. The vote, when it comes, favors putting some passengers ashore at the next suitable landing, accepting certain death for some to improve survival chances for others. The decision splits families and destroys friendships that had survived combat and disease, creating divisions that will never heal even if everyone somehow survives the disaster. Those selected for abandonment, chosen through a combination of age, health status, and family size, react with everything from resignation to rage. Some accept their fate quietly, understanding the mathematics of survival, even if they don't like the conclusions those calculations force upon everyone. Others threaten violence, promising to take others down with them if they're forced off the ship to die alone on some desolate coastline. You find yourself on the survival list, partly because of your age and partly because your father's skills as a metalworker make him valuable to any community that will accept refugees. The guilt of being chosen while others are abandoned eats at your conscience, but speaking against the decision would only result in your family joining the condemned. The selection process reveals how quickly moral certainties can collapse when survival is at stake. People who argued for fairness and equality when everyone was safe now advocate for their own family's welfare when death becomes immediate and personal. Abstract principles prove inadequate when faced with specific human face. The landing, when it finally comes, takes place on a desolate stretch of Greenland coast, where rocky cliffs meet endless ice that extends beyond the horizon. 37 refugees are put ashore with minimal supplies and promises of rescue ships that everyone knows are lies designed to make the abandonment easier to bear. The abandoned survivors stand on the beach in the gathering dusk, their silhouettes dark against the white landscape that will become their grave. They wave farewell with the dignity of people who understand that they've been sacrificed for the greater good, even as they face certain death with whatever courage they can muster. Your last view of them shows figures becoming smaller and smaller against the vast emptiness of the Arctic landscape until they disappear entirely into the distance and the growing dark. The ship continues northward, lighter now but carrying a cargo of guilt that weighs more than the passengers who were abandoned. The ship continues northward, carrying fewer people but no less suffering than before. Conversations become stilted and uncomfortable, avoiding topics that might lead to discussions of the landing or the friends and family members who were left behind to die. People avoid eye contact, afraid of seeing their own shame reflected in other faces. 3 more weeks pass before Greenland's main settlement appears on the horizon, a cluster of buildings that represent salvation for the survivors and condemnation for those left behind. The reception is less than warm, but not actively hostile. The colonists understand disaster, having faced their own struggles with weather and natives and the constant threat of starvation. But integration proves more difficult than simple survival, involving challenges that go beyond finding food and shelter. The refugees bring skills and labor, but they also bring mouths to feed and stories that challenge the carefully maintained optimism necessary for colonial life. Their experiences in America serve as warnings about what can happen when the balance between cooperation and conflict finally tips toward violence. The refugees are living proof that colonial success isn't guaranteed, that careful planning and good intentions can't prevent disasters that destroy everything people hope to build. You find yourself assigned to work in the smithy, learning advanced techniques from craftsmen who've never seen the forests and fjords that shaped your childhood. The work is familiar, but the context is alien, like speaking a known language with an unfamiliar accent that marks you as foreign. Your family receives shelter in a longhouse already occupied by 3 other families. Privacy sacrificed to practicality in a community where resources are allocated by need rather than preference. The sleeping arrangements are better than the ship, but worse than anything you'd known in the settlement. The crowded conditions breed tension and conflict as people struggle to adapt to circumstances that no one would choose, but everyone must accept. Personal habits that were merely annoying in larger spaces become sources of serious friction when privacy doesn't exist and escape is impossible. Winter settles over Greenland with the weight of finality, closing the sea routes and confirming that the abandoned refugees are beyond help. Snow covers the ground and ice locks the harbor, creating the isolation that defines Arctic life for the next 6 months. The colony will survive on stored supplies and its own ingenuity, cut off from the outside world by weather that can kill the unprepared in minutes. For the refugees, this isolation feels like imprisonment rather than protection, trapping them in circumstances they never chose with people they didn't select. The refugees settle into their new routines with the grim acceptance of people who've learned that complaining changes nothing and resistance is futile. They work when work is available. They eat sparingly when food is provided. They sleep poorly in spaces that offer shelter but not comfort. They try not to think too much about the friends and family members who didn't survive the journey, the communities that were destroyed, the lives that were lost for reasons that still don't make complete sense. Survival, it turns out, is a skill that can be learned but never mastered, practiced daily but never perfected. As the long Arctic night descends, bringing months of darkness that seemed to match the emotional landscape of loss and displacement. You lie in your shared sleeping space, listening to the wind howl across the... Somewhere far to the south, the ruins of your settlement are buried under snow, reclaimed by the wilderness that had seemed so welcoming just a few months ago. The dreams you'd carried of building something permanent in the new world have been replaced by the more modest goal of simply seeing another spring, of surviving through the winter months without losing more friends and family members to cold, disease, or despair. Tomorrow will bring more work, more rationed food, more careful conversations that avoid mentioning the people who were left behind. It will bring another day of survival, in a life that has been reduced to its most basic elements, stripped of everything except the fundamental struggle to continue existing. And perhaps, if you're very lucky, it will bring one day closer to the possibility of building something new from the ashes of what was lost, of learning from the mistakes that led to disaster, of creating a future that honors the sacrifices of those who didn't survive to see. But tonight, as sleep finally comes despite the cold and crowding and constant awareness of how precarious your situation remains, you dream not of the future, but of the past, of a time when life held possibilities beyond mere survival, when community meant something more than shared desperation. In your dreams, the settlement still stands, your friends are still alive, and the careful balance between Norse ambition and American reality holds firm against the forces that would destroy it. In your dreams, different choices led to different outcomes. Wisdom prevailed over pride, and cooperation triumphed over conflict. But dreams, however beautiful, can't change the reality of what was lost when that balance finally broke, when friendship turned to warfare, when the promise of a new world was consumed by the oldest of human faith. 2 years have passed since the evacuation, and you're standing on a Greenland hilltop, watching ships disappear into the southern horizon. The vessels carry word back to Iceland and Norway, reports that will shape how the Norse world remembers the American experiment for generations to come. You know what those reports will say, because you helped write them. The wind carries the salt smell of the sea, mixed with the cleaner scent of snow and ice, familiar odors that have become the backdrop of your exile. The landscape stretches endlessly in all directions, white and empty and unforgiving, a reminder of the price paid for survival when survival requires abandoning everything that made life worth living. The official version speaks of hostile natives and impossible geography, of challenges that made permanent settlement impractical rather than It's a politically necessary fiction that allows the jarls and kings who funded the expeditions to save face, while quietly abandoning any plans for future colonization attempts. The reports describe fierce warriors and impassable terrain, climate conditions that defeated even Norse ingenuity, and diplomatic failures that resulted from native treachery rather than European misunderstanding. They create a narrative where defeat was inevitable rather than preventable, where withdrawal was strategic rather than desperate. But you know the real story, the one that can't be written in formal reports because it asks uncomfortable questions about Norse assumptions and capabilities. The American colonies didn't fail because the land was hostile or the natives were savage. They failed because your people never learned to think like Americans rather than displaced Europe. The settlement that raised you had been built using Norwegian techniques for Norwegian problems, European solutions applied to American challenges, without considering whether the fundamental assumptions made sense in a completely different context. Every aspect of colonial life had been an attempt to recreate familiar patterns in unfamiliar circumstances. Long houses designed for Scandinavian weather patterns that couldn't handle American temperature defensive strategies developed for European enemies who fought according to European rules, economic models based on trade relationships that assumed Norse superiority and native dependency, social structures that worked in homogeneous communities but broke down when cultural diversity became a factor. The natives, meanwhile, had spent thousands of years learning to live as Americans, developing solutions to problems that Europeans didn't even recognize as problems. They understood the continental weather patterns that could bring drought or flood without warning, the migration routes that determined food availability, the political relationships that governed territorial access. They knew which alliances were worth cultivating and which enemies were worth facing, when to cooperate and when to resist, how to balance immediate needs against long-term consequences. Most importantly, they recognized that the land itself was a participant in human affairs, not just a stage where human dramas played out. Your generation had begun to understand these differences, learning to adapt Norse traditions to American realities through trial and error that cost time and lives. But understanding came too late, after political and military situations had moved beyond accommodation. By the time you'd learned to plant native crops and trade with local tribes, larger forces had already determined the outcome. The Southern Confederacy that destroyed the settlements wasn't reacting to immediate Norse actions, but to the long-term implications of permanent European presence. They'd recognized that successful colonies grow, that temporary visitors eventually become permanent residents, that guests eventually claim rights that supersede host prerogatives. They'd seen what happened to other continents when European colonization reached critical mass, perhaps through trade networks that carried information across vast distances, perhaps through their own exploration and diplomatic contacts. The destruction of the Norse settlements was preventive medicine, designed to stop a disease before it could spread. From this perspective, the war that ended your childhood wasn't a clash between civilization and savagery, but between two different models of human organization that couldn't coexist in the same territory. The Norse brought European concepts of individual ownership, hierarchical authority, and technological superiority. The natives offered American ideas of shared resources, consensual leadership, and environmental adaptation. Both models had strengths and weaknesses, advantages and limitations that became apparent only when they encountered each other directly. European technology could produce superior weapons and tools, but American knowledge could prevent starvation and disease. European organization could mobilize resources efficiently, but American diplomacy could maintain peace between diverse groups. The conflict was probably inevitable, once both sides understood what was at stake and recognized that compromise would require fundamental changes that neither was willing or able to make. Coexistence had been possible as long as the Norse remained visitors rather than permanent residents, traders rather than landowners, guests rather than. But successful colonies, by definition, change from temporary expedients into permanent fixtures, and permanent fixtures always challenge existing power structures. The Norse couldn't remain visitors indefinitely without abandoning the colonial project entirely, and the natives couldn't accept permanent residence without fundamentally altering their own society. The tragedy wasn't that the war happened, but that it happened so completely, consuming moderates along with extremists and destroying possibilities that might have benefited everyone. The moderate voices on both sides, the people who wanted to find accommodation between European ambitions and American realities, were overwhelmed by extremists who saw compromise as surrender. Your friend Ravenswing probably died fighting against the very settlement where he'd been a welcomed guest, forced to choose sides in a conflict that his own efforts had tried to prevent. The nuanced relationship between Norse and Skraeling that had been developing through years of careful negotiation was swept away by political forces that reduced complex situations to simple choices. What might have been different if the approach had been fundamentally altered from the beginning, if the experimental nature of the colonial project had been acknowledged rather than hidden? If Norse colonists had come as refugees rather than conquerors, seeking permission rather than claiming rights? If the expeditions had been organized around learning from American societies rather than reproducing European? Such questions torment the survivors because they suggest that disaster was inevitable, that different choices might have led to different outcomes that preserved both Norse ambitions and native. The families who died defending settlements that were doomed from conception might have lived full lives in communities that understood their place in the larger American context. But alternative history is a luxury that survival doesn't permit, and speculation about what might have been can't change what actually happened. The refugees who made it to Greenland have had to focus on immediate necessities, finding work, securing shelter, integrating into existing communities that view them with mixtures of sympathy and. There's been no time for the kind of analysis that might prevent future disasters, no opportunity to process the lessons that disaster teaches about the differences between what people think they know and what they actually understand. The demands of daily survival consume all available energy, leaving none for reflection or learning. Your own situation illustrates the complexity of starting over after total loss when everything you've learned is adapted to circumstances that no longer exist. Your skills as a metalworker are valuable, but they're Norwegian metalworking skills adapted to American materials and conditions that aren't available in Greenland. The techniques that worked with American iron ore and coal don't translate directly to Greenland's resources, requiring modifications and adaptations that essentially mean relearning your trade from the... You've had to accept the status of apprentice despite years of experience, starting over in a profession you thought you'd already... Your family has fared better than most refugees, partly because your father's reputation preceded him, and partly because your mother's medical knowledge proved immediately useful to a community that has its own health challenges. But integration has come at the cost of identity, requiring cultural changes that feel like losses rather than You're no longer American Norse, the unique hybrid culture that had been developing in the settlements through the combination of European traditions and New World realities. You're refugees, foreigners, people defined by loss rather than achievement, by what you've fled from rather than what you're building toward. The younger refugees, the children who grew up expecting American lives but were forced to adapt to Greenland existence, have adjusted most successfully to their new circumstances. They've learned new languages, new customs, new expectations with the flexibility that childhood permits, absorbing change without the resistance that characterizes adult responses. But they've also lost connection to the world that shaped their early years, becoming strangers to their own memories and origins. They remember the settlement as a dream that might not have been real, their American childhood as a story told by adults who might be making it up to comfort them. The older refugees struggle more obviously with displacement that affects every aspect of their daily lives. Men and women who are community leaders in America find themselves reduced to manual laborers in Greenland, their expertise irrelevant to their new circumstances. Status and authority that seemed permanent evaporate like morning mist when circumstances change. Some refugees have given up entirely on the idea of rebuilding lives that were destroyed by forces beyond their control. They've accepted positions as permanent dependents, grateful for charity, but unwilling to invest energy in creating new lives that might also be destroyed by disasters they can't predict or prevent. It's a rational response to trauma that teaches people that effort doesn't guarantee results, that planning doesn't prevent disaster, that the best laid plans can be destroyed by circumstances that no one saw. But it's also a response that condemns them to perpetual marginality, making them permanent outsiders in every community. Others have thrown themselves into Greenland life with desperate intensity, trying to prove their worth through excessive productivity and absolute loyalty to their new community. They work longer hours than necessary, volunteer for dangerous assignments, offer skills and knowledge without being asked, seeking acceptance through performance rather than relation. It's another rational response to circumstances that make them dependent on others' goodwill, but one that exhausts both the individual and the community that receives such intent. The desperation shows, marking the refugees as people who don't quite belong despite their contributions and efforts. A few refugees have chosen a third path, preparation for return to America under different circumstances that might make success possible where previous attempts. They maintain American skills, preserve American knowledge, and plan for the day when conditions might permit new colonization attempts. It's probably the least rational response, given the political and practical obstacles to renewed expansion and the evidence that previous failures reflected fundamental problems rather than temporary setbacks. But it provides psychological comfort that acceptance and integration cannot, maintaining hope when hope seems irrelevant. You find yourself somewhere between these approaches, unwilling to abandon American possibilities, but realistic about Greenland limitations and the likelihood that return will ever. The metalworking techniques you've adapted for local conditions incorporate lessons learned from both Norse and Skraeling traditions, creating something new from the combination of old knowledge and new. Your social relationships bridge refugee and resident communities without fully belonging to either, providing perspective that pure integration or pure isolation would not. You can see how Greenland colonization differs from the American attempts, what lessons have been learned and what mistakes continue to be. The insights are valuable, but also frustrating, because institutional change happens slowly, and individual voices carry limited weight in communities focused on immediate survival rather than long-term impact. Knowledge gained through suffering gets lost when the people who suffered lack the authority to influence decisions. Greenland's advantages over America are obvious to anyone who survived the destruction of the settlements and understands what went wrong with the earlier colonial. The native population is smaller, less organized, and less capable of coordinated resistance across large territories. The geography favors small, isolated communities over large territorial holdings that require extensive. The economic model depends on sustainable exploitation of local resources, rather than unlimited expansion that inevitably brings conflict with established. The climate is harsh but predictable, creating challenges that can be anticipated and prepared for, rather than surprises that overwhelm planning. But Greenland also illustrates the limitations of Norse colonial thinking that contributed to American. The settlement remains fundamentally European in conception, a Norwegian outpost rather than a Greenlandic community that grows from local conditions rather than being imposed. Contact with local natives is minimal and largely commercial, involving trade relationships that maintain distance rather than building the understanding that prevents. Environmental adaptation focuses on technological solutions that overcome natural obstacles rather than cultural flexibility that works with naturals. Most significantly, Greenland colonization continues to assume that European methods will eventually overcome American challenges through superior organization and tech. There's little recognition that different continents might require different approaches, that successful colonization might demand cultural transformation rather than just geographic relocation. The reports being carried back to Europe will reinforce these assumptions by emphasizing external obstacles rather than internal limitations, describing American failure in terms of native hostility and geographic challenges rather than cultural inadequacy and strategic. Future colonial attempts will probably repeat the same fundamental errors that doomed the American settlements. This creates a cycle where each colonial generation rediscovers the same limitations through the same catastrophic process, where knowledge gained through suffering is lost through pride, and wisdom purchased with blood is squandered through the conviction that next time will be different, because next time will involve better planning or superior. Your own knowledge of American realities will probably die with your generation, replaced by simplified narratives that make political sense but provide poor guidance for future policy. The children who survive to adulthood will remember Greenland rather than America as their homeland, carrying European rather than American lessons into whatever future. The specific lessons learned through disaster will be generalized into platitudes about native hostility and geographical challenges that obscure the real reasons for colonial. The complex truth about cultural failure will be simplified into comfortable myths about inevitable conflict that make future disasters more likely rather than. Unless somehow the real story can be preserved and transmitted, despite political pressures to forget it, despite the natural human tendency to simplify complex situations into manageables, unless someone finds a way to document the actual reasons for colonial failure in terms that future expeditions might understand. This is why you've spent evening hours writing when fatigue and cold make writing difficult, creating the informal record that official reports cannot contain. Not because you expect the writing to change anything immediately, but because truth has value independent of its immediate utility, because someone someday might need to understand what actually. The writing process has also served therapeutic purposes, helping you process experiences that normal conversation cannot accommodate, because they involve guilt and loss that others either can't understand or don't want. The friends who died defending a doomed settlement deserve more than official silence and political. The families who were sacrificed during the evacuation deserve recognition beyond statistical footnotes that reduce human tragedy to bureaucratic convenience. The communities that were destroyed deserve analysis that goes beyond blaming external forces, that acknowledges internal failures and missed opportunities. But perhaps most importantly, the alternative possibilities that were lost when accommodation failed deserve exploration, even if only in imagination and speculation about what might. The hybrid culture that might have developed if Norse and Skraeling traditions had been allowed to merge organically, rather than being forced into. The technologies that might have emerged from combining European engineering with American environmental knowledge, creating solutions that neither culture could have developed independently. The political structures that might have evolved from blending European hierarchy with American consensus, balancing efficiency with legitimacy in ways that satisfied both. These lost possibilities haunt refugee communities because they represent roads not taken, choices that might have led to dramatically different outcomes if circumstances had been slightly different, or if key individuals had made different decisions at crucial moments. They also provide hope for future attempts at cultural synthesis, assuming anyone ever gets the chance to apply lessons learned through. The ships carrying reports back to Europe will be followed by other ships bringing new colonists, new supplies, new attempts at permanent settlement in territories that previous expeditions failed to hold. The cycle will continue because the political and economic forces that drive expansion don't learn from individual failures, only from systematic collapse that affects entire. But perhaps, hidden among the cargo and passengers of future expeditions, someone will carry knowledge gained through suffering rather than optimism born of ignorance. Perhaps someone will remember that successful colonization requires transformation rather than just relocation, that different continents demand different. Perhaps someone will understand that cooperation might succeed where conquest has failed, that adaptation might achieve what domination could not, that learning from native peoples might be more effective than trying to teach them European ways. And perhaps someday, when the political situation permits and the practical obstacles have been overcome, Norse colonists will return to America with wisdom purchased through blood and humility learned. They'll build settlements that belong to the American landscape rather than being imposed upon it, communities that grow from local conditions rather than Europeans. They'll forge relationships with native peoples based on mutual benefit rather than assume superiority, creating alliances that strengthen both cultures rather than destroying one to benefit. The children of such settlements will grow up as true Americans, shaped by continental realities rather than European memories, carrying forward the best of both traditions while creating something entirely new. They'll face challenges that their parents can't imagine, and develop solutions that previous generations couldn't conceive. They'll create cultures that honor both their heritage and their homeland, building bridges between worlds rather than choosing sides in unnecessary. Their success will justify the sacrifices made by earlier generations, transforming tragedy into triumph through the application of wisdom gained through suffering. But that future, if it ever comes, will be built on foundations laid by people who paid the ultimate price for insufficient preparation and inadequate understanding. The friends who died defending indefensible positions because they didn't understand the nature of the conflict. The families who were sacrificed to permit others' survival because circumstances forced impossible choices upon people who were unprepared to make them. The communities that were destroyed because they couldn't adapt quickly enough to changed circumstances that overwhelmed their capacity. Their sacrifice gives meaning to survival, but only if survival leads to wisdom rather than just continued existence. Only if the lessons learned through disaster are preserved and transmitted rather than forgotten. Only if the truth about cultural failure can somehow penetrate the comfortable myths that make future As the ships disappear over the southern horizon, carrying their cargo of official lies and political necessities, you return to your writing in the long Arctic evening. Tonight, you'll record another fragment of truth, another piece of the puzzle that might someday help someone understand why good people with reasonable intentions can create disasters that destroy everything they hope. The aurora borealis begins its nightly dance across the northern sky, sheets of green and blue light that pulse with otherworldly energy. The natives have their own explanations for this phenomenon, stories about spirits and ancestors, and the boundary between worlds that European science dismisses, but American experience. You watch the lights shift and flow across the darkness, thinking about boundaries and connections, about the spaces between worlds where different possibilities exist. Somewhere beyond that, aurora, beyond the ice and the endless ocean, the ruins of your settlement lie buried under snow. But also beyond that aurora, beyond the immediate horizon of loss and displacement, other possibilities wait to be discovered by people who've learned to think beyond the limitations of their own experience. The future remains unwritten, its chapters blank pages waiting for someone with enough wisdom to fill. Tomorrow will bring more metalworking, more integration into Greenland society, more adaptation to circumstances that you never chose but must accept because survival requires accommodation to reality rather than resistance to change. It will bring another day of building whatever life is possible within the constraints that disaster. But tonight, in the quiet hours when honest reflection becomes possible, and the demands of survival relax enough to permit thought about larger questions, you'll remember friends who deserved better than they received, communities that deserved more wisdom than they possessed, and possibilities that deserved more time than circumstance. And perhaps, through the act of remembering and recording, through the discipline of preserving truth despite pressure to forget it, you'll help ensure that their sacrifices weren't completely wasted, that their deaths might somehow contribute to future lives, that the wisdom gained through suffering might eventually be applied to prevent future. The echo of their voices carries across the years, speaking truths that official reports cannot contain, warning future generations about dangers that political necessity requires them to discover independently. Listen carefully to those echoes, because they're all that remains of a world that they speak from the darkness to light the way toward possibilities that still await realization, toward futures where cooperation replaces conquest, where adaptation trumps domination, where the hard-won wisdom of one generation becomes the foundation for the next generation. The Norse conquered America in dreams and songs and stories told around winter fires, in the only realm where conquest ever truly succeeds, the endless territory of human imagination, where every possibility remains alive and every failure contains the seeds of future success. In that realm the settlement still stands, the balance holds, and the dream of two worlds becoming one continues to offer hope for those wise enough to learn from what was lost and brave enough to try again.